Good afternoon, Year 6. Today in our science session, we are building on our knowledge of how to classify and sort organisms from the previous 2 weeks' work, where we looked at animals, and we're going to build this into understanding of how we could sort and classify plants. Okay, we're going to go through some work looking at what we've already done after we've looked at what a good lesson would look like. So, hopefully, by the end of today, if we engage well with the learning, we'll understand some plants are different to others. We'll understand what vascular and non-vascular plants are. We will be able to sort plants based on whether they are flowering and or whether they produce seeds. And finally, we will understand that we can classify plants in such a way that we can design a garden which shows different variants and different groups of plants within it. Right, guys, first of all, a little bit of recall. Last week, you looked at some different organisms which were classified. Just a really quick thing. Can you remember these two animals? What were these two animals? So one of them was an aquatic carnivore with no legs, which had fins. One of these was a land-living animal, which is a herbivore with 4 legs and antlers. Pause while you remember. Hopefully, guys, you've identified that the dolphin was the aquatic animal which was first sorted, and the second one was the gazelle, which was that herbivore which we looked at last week. Okay, so those two animals which we classified last week. Okay, as with previous weeks and in previous lessons in other subjects, we're thinking about vocabulary, so we're thinking about that word botanist. Now, rather than me just giving you a task of going away and completing this on your own, I thought I'd give you a little bit of assistance. We've seen the word botanist recently when we've been looking within our geography at the researcher Koppen, who looked at different ways in which plants grew around the world and how that underpinned his understanding of biomes. Now, within that, we can also understand that some scientists are less globally viewing, and they just look at particular groups of plants. So if we have a think about what botanist means, then it's an expert in or a student of the scientific study of plants. So it's somebody who investigates plants and understands how they grow and accesses that information scientifically. The word botany comes from the ancient Greek word which means botane, which means pasture, grass, or fodder. So a lot of words derived from either Greek or Latin, and this word derives from Greek, where botany comes from pasture, grass, or fodder, so places where things grow. Here's a picture of a scientist who's a botanist, so they're examining, they're investigating, they're doing experiments within plants. Now, your first task then today will be to think of some synonyms, antonyms, and then to use the word botanist in a sentence. So you've got this sheet on your task sheet that's sent through today. Okay, so if you can have a go doing that. Now, if you have a look at these plants, we've got a daisy, a birch tree, an oak tree, a cabbage, barley, rhododendron, orange tree, ivy, fern, moss, gravy, and cosmos. So we've got these 12 different plants. What I'd like you to do is your first task in your head, and pause the video while you're doing that. If we were trying to group some of these plants together so we can find a partner for some of these plants within the picture on the screen, or we can find some that are linked somehow, which would you link? So look around, look at the features of these different plants that you can see on the screen. Which ones would you link together? Which ones would you put in the same group? Which ones would you classify together? So pause while you think about that. See if you can see which ones I come up with. Okay, guys, now what I'm going to show you is some that I've grouped as pairs, and see if you can identify why I've put them together as pairs. So our first one's the birch tree, the oak tree. The second word in all the descriptions of those probably tells you they are all, well done, Renicious, trees. Yes, they're all trees. Okay, so that means that they're raised off the ground by those trunks. Okay, so we've got trees. Second pair that I've put together, I'll just show you the picture again before I colour in the rhododendron and the cosmos. See if you can identify. Well done, Kyron. Yeah, they are flowering, and actually, if you look at the flowers of these, they're both purple flowering plants. Okay, and the final pair I picked, and this was just done quickly, and you might have had different pairs. The final pair I picked was the orange tree and the cabbage. Eva, what do you reckon? Why have I picked those two together? Yeah, it's because they feed you. Okay, these are both items that we eat. Okay, so they both grow fruit or they grow elements that we consume. Okay, so that's how I've sorted them. There's lots of different ways you could sort things. And some of these you could actually divide in other ways. So we've got cosmos, rhododendron, but also we can see that daisy is a flowering plant. Okay, so there's lots of different ways that we can sort, we can classify plants. Botanists, so these scientists who study plants, have lots of ways of classifying plants to identify them, just the same way we did with our mammals and our reptiles and our other groups within animals. Now, all plants, though, do have some things in common. What do they all have in common, do you think? Are they all flowering? Are they all green? Can you eat the product of all of them? What have they all got in common? Hopefully you've had a think about that. Maybe you've identified something. We think that how we can group these plants in common. Okay, so they're all living, you might say. Well, how can we group them all in common? Okay, so we have these big umbrella groups, these broad groups. So rather than saying all of the pansies, we might say all of the plants which have flowers on. Okay, and rather than saying just orange trees, we might say all of the trees which produce fruit. So there's different broader groups, so these wider groups, these broader groups. And we're thinking today a little bit about how we can broaden our groups. There's lots of different examples there's lots of differences between plants and animals. Plants can't move by themselves. They cannot get up and walk away if they decide that they like one bit of soil better than the other. And I'm a bit worried, Divine, because when we come back to class, I'm a bit worried that Rose might have either gone in the bin or walked away to a different classroom that waters it better. So we must look after that when we get back. Okay, they also evolve. They also adapt to their surroundings, and that's actually something similar to humans. If you remember our work on Darwin, where we looked at how species had changed, such as those Arctic fox, can you think about something else that has adapted to its surroundings? And here we've got the idea of the plants. So certain plants are suitable for their surroundings, such as cacti, only grow in places that are arid, where there isn't a great deal of liquid. Okay, and they can suit them as animals do. Okay. Now, there's two really simple broad groups. So remember the idea of that broad umbrella that we can group plants together. That's vascular and non-vascular group. Okay. Now, if you know what they mean, great. You're a skilled botanist already and you've got a great command of the English language. If you're not sure, then hopefully when we go through these two definitions, you'll understand what vascular and non-vascular mean. So vascular plants, they have this system which transports and moves water and nutrients, so the things that they need from the soil, to different parts of the plant. Okay, they all have a root and a stem. Okay, so if you think about our water cycle, where the water is coming around, it's going down into the ground as precipitation leads to fall into the ground. So rain or snow leads to water on the ground. It goes into the soil. When it's in the soil, those roots acting as an anchor and holding the plant in place. And the system, that transportation system for the water, brings it up from the roots, which absorb the water from the soil. The stem then transports it up to the different parts of the plant which need the liquid, the water, and the nutrients to be able to live. So that's a vascular plant. Okay, they're locked into the soil. They're rooted in the soil, and that root absorbs the water, and then it's transported through the stem. Non-vascular plants don't have that root in the stem. Okay, so if you think about the prefix of non is going to be the opposite to that which it does have. Vascular does have roots and stem. Non-vascular does not have roots and stem. They have tiny little hairs called rhizoids, which latch on. Think about something latching onto you, latch on to a surface, such as the ground, a rock, or a tree trunk. And they keep the plant in place by doing that. They absorb water. They bring up the water in the same way the roots did, but they absorb water from their environment. Okay, but they don't have the roots themselves. But both types of plant, vascular and non-vascular, both absorb water. Some examples of these non-vascular types are mosses, hornworts, and liverworts. Okay, they've got lovely names. They sound like rolled out plants that you put in a mixture that you wouldn't want to consume. So mosses, hornworts, and liverworts are all examples of non-vascular plants. Well done, guys. And these non-vascular plants are less complex than vascular plants. They're not as complicated if you look at them, break them down. Sorry. They're also smaller as the plant is not able to transport water. So because they don't have that water coming into them, which that can be transported around them, they don't grow to a greater size. And the nutrients can't spread around them. Okay, so the amount that they can grow, the way in which they can grow is affected. So if you think about it as a human or a living an animal, if we could not get water, not get food, we wouldn't grow anywhere near as much as something that can get food like we can. Okay. Now, if we have a look at this plant, have a think about what you notice about the features of this plant. I'm not telling you yet whether it's vascular or non-vascular, but I'm trying to think if there's another subsection we could divide it into. So think about what plant you think that might be and how you could subdivide that. Pause it. What do you think, non-vascular or vascular? Okay. No, so sometimes you can look at flowering or non-flowering plants. Non-vascular plants are all non-flowering, but some non-flowering plants, such as ferns, do reproduce using spores, so they don't need seeds. Okay, so non-vascular are part of the non-flowering, but if you look at this fern, it is a vascular plant because it has those roots, but it's a non-flowering plant. So now we've split, rather than just having vascular. Sorry, I'm trying to get on the camera. Vascular and non-vascular. We've also got the idea of flowering and non-flowering. We know that certain plants produce flowers. We know certain plants don't. Okay. Look at these. How could we classify these two plants? We've got pines there. They're all non-flowering trees and pine cones. What do we notice about these cones on these pine trees? Lots of us thinking about that, pulling through this notion. Yeah, so these are non-flowering plants, and they've got seeds that are not protected by a flower. Okay, so the seeds sometimes are not protected by a flower, and therefore they might be more vulnerable to animals which might come and try and consume them. They do not produce flowers because they do not need to. Okay, so sometimes flowers are used as a way of attracting or protecting. So it's either attracting something such as a pollinator, or it might be to protect a seed to stop it being damaged. Okay, so the purpose of these non-flowering plants is different. Now, most of our plants fall into these flowering plant group, though. It's interesting to understand why most plants are flowering, whether that's just because they're pollinated, whether it's because people have cultivated, so looked after. So botanists might have cultivated flowering plants because people thought they're pretty, we like them. So all of these 12 plants now we can see on the screen are flowering plants. Looking at these, how could you sort these? How could you group these? What questions could you ask as you sorted these? Have a think. Because we know, because they are vascular plants, sorry, they're flowering, they're therefore vascular plants. So these vascular plants, these vascular flowering plants, how could we subcategorize these? Some of you might be looking at where they could grow. Some of you might be categorizing them based on whether they have flowers or they produce fruit. Some of you might be deciding whether they're ground or aerially based. Some of you might think about how they disperse seeds. Now, next slide is going to show you this classification key. Okay, if we look at this, it's going to hopefully break down how you could almost classify different things as you would do as you were going through it if you had all of them in front of you. So plants are either non-vascular or vascular. But then within vascular, we've got the ones that have seeds or don't have seeds. We've got ones that, of those that have seeds, some of them flower, some of them don't flower. Okay, and then we've got the idea that some vascular plants are also those ones that don't have seeds, so they don't reproduce by seeds being spread around, but they reproduce by something called spores, which is slightly different. Now, if you think about these plants that we've sorted, rather than having these titles of plant, non-vascular, vascular, has seeds, no seeds, if you change those elements of this classification grid, how could you classify these flowering plants? What questions would you ask? Because that's going to be one of your tasks later on. And that's just listing, so you've got it at hand, those different plants, which are the non-vascular